500 BC. While Athens debates philosophy in marble courtyards and Persian kings count their gold in palace treasuries, a different kind of power is rising on the open grasslands stretching from Ukraine to Siberia. No cities, no written language, no permanent home, just horses, bows, and a warrior code so ruthless it turned the human body itself into raw material. Drinking cups, quivers, trophies stripped from the fallen and worn as proof of status. For 2 centuries they made the mightiest empire on earth retreat without a single decisive battle. This is the story of the Scythians, and the historian who recorded their world in such disturbing detail that for 2,000 years nobody quite believed him. Around 500 BC, if you had stood at the edge of the vast Eurasian Steppe, that unbroken sweep of grassland running from the Ukrainian plains in the west through southern Russia and Kazakhstan to the borders of Siberia in the east, you would have been standing at the edge of an empire that had no capital city, no monumental architecture, and no written script, yet commanded more territory than most of the ancient world's celebrated civilizations combined. This was the domain of the Scythians, a confederation of nomadic peoples whose way of life was so fundamentally different from that of their settled neighbors in Greece, Persia, and Mesopotamia, that those neighbors struggled, in their own historical accounts, to even properly categorize what kind of civilization they were dealing with. The Scythians did not build cities because they did not need cities. Their entire existence was organized around mobility, the constant, seasonal movement of people, herds, and households across the grasslands in search of fresh pasture, a pattern of life that made permanent settlements not just unnecessary, but actively impractical. Where a Greek or Persian household was anchored to a fixed plot of land, a Scythian household travelled on wheels, its felt-covered wagons serving as mobile homes that could be dismantled, moved, and reassembled as the herds required. Children were born, grew up, and often died without ever sleeping in a structure that could not be pulled by oxen. At the centre of this entire way of life stood the horse, and it is difficult to overstate how thoroughly the horse shaped every dimension of Scythian society, economy, and warfare. This was not a culture that used horses. It was a culture built around horses in the way that later agricultural civilizations were built around wheat or rice, as the single organizing resource around which everything else in daily life had to be arranged. Scythian children reportedly learned to ride before they learned to walk, with full confidence on their own 2 feet, and archery training began early enough that competent mounted marksmanship had become, by adulthood, less a learned skill than an unconscious extension of the body itself. This combination of horsemanship and archery produced a military innovation that would echo across the following 2 millennia of Eurasian warfare. The mounted horse archer, capable of firing accurately while riding at a full gallop, using a small, powerful recurve bow specifically engineered for use from horseback rather than the larger bows favoured by infantry archers in settled civilizations. The Scythian bow, constructed from a laminated combination of wood, horn, and sinew under tension, was compact enough to be drawn and fired from a moving horse, but powerful enough to penetrate the bronze and leather armour that Greek and Persian infantry relied upon for protection. Alongside the bow, Scythian warriors carried a distinctive battle axe, known as the sagaris, a weapon specifically designed for close-quarters fighting once an engagement moved past the range at which arrows remained effective, capable of crushing through skull and bone with a single well-placed blow. What made this combination of weapons and mounted mobility so devastating to the settled civilizations that periodically found themselves in conflict with Scythian forces was not simply individual battlefield lethality, though that was considerable, but the strategic flexibility mobility provided. A Scythian warband could strike a target, inflict damage, and disappear back into the open grassland before a conventional army, built around slower-moving infantry formations, could organize any effective response. Greek and Persian military commanders, trained in a tradition of pitched battles between organized infantry lines, found themselves confronting an enemy that consistently refused to fight on those terms, preferring instead a style of warfare built around raids, ambushes, and the deliberate avoidance of decisive confrontation, until circumstances favored the more mobile, more lightly equipped Scythian forces. Much of what we know about Scythian society and military culture in this level of specific, granular detail comes from a single extraordinary source. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, who devoted an entire book of his sprawling histories specifically to documenting Scythian customs, geography, and warfare. Herodotus's account is neither a hostile propaganda piece nor an uncritical romanticization. It reads, in large part, as the work of a genuinely curious observer attempting to record, as accurately as his sources allowed, the practices of a people whose way of life differed so dramatically from his own Greek context that he clearly recognized its documentary value regardless of how disturbing some of the specific customs he described might have struck his original Greek audience. For centuries after Herodotus's death, subsequent generations of historians treated many of his more startling claims about Scythian customs with considerable skepticism, assuming that a Greek historian working several centuries before the modern archaeological method had likely exaggerated, misunderstood, or simply repeated unreliable second-hand rumors about a distant and poorly understood people. It would take the patient work of archaeologists excavating burial sites across the Russian and Ukrainian steppe, beginning in earnest in the 20th century, and continuing with increasingly sophisticated forensic techniques into the 21st, to establish just how much of Herodotus's disturbing account was not exaggeration at all, but a remarkably accurate record of practices that left physical, verifiable traces in the archaeological record, traces that modern science would eventually be able to confirm with a level of certainty Herodotus himself could never have imagined. It is worth setting the broader geopolitical stage a little more fully before moving into the specifics of Scythian warrior culture, because the position the Scythians occupied in relation to their settled neighbors shaped nearly everything about how those neighbors chose to remember them. To the Greeks colonizing the northern shores of the Black Sea, the Scythians were simultaneously trading partners, supplying grain, furs, and slaves that fed and clothed the Greek world, and an ever-present military anxiety, a people whose territory bordered Greek colonial settlements closely enough that peaceful commerce and outright warfare could shift from one to the other with very little warning. To the Persian Empire, expanding aggressively northward and eastward under successive kings determined to bring every neighboring power under centralized imperial control, the Scythians represented something rarer and more troubling, a power that could simply not be conquered through the conventional methods that had subdued dozens of other peoples across 3 continents. This dual reputation, indispensable trading partner and unconquerable military threat, is precisely the tension that runs through nearly every surviving ancient account of who the Scythians actually were. Within Scythian warrior culture, status was not conferred by age, lineage, or accumulated wealth in the manner that many settled agricultural civilizations organized their social hierarchies. It was conferred, first and fundamentally, by killing. A young man's transition into full recognized manhood within the community was marked not by a birthday, a coming-of-age ceremony divorced from actual accomplishment, or a formal rite of passage administered by elders regardless of individual merit, but by the concrete, verifiable act of killing an enemy in combat for the first time. Herodotus records that this first kill required a specific and, to Greek sensibilities, genuinely shocking ritual completion. The young warrior was required to drink the blood of the enemy he had just killed, consuming it while still warm from the body. The underlying belief system driving this practice, as Herodotus understood and recorded it, held that an enemy's vital essence, their strength, their courage, their fighting spirit, resided in their blood, and that consuming it directly transferred some portion of that essence to the killer, strengthening the young warrior's own capacity for future combat through what amounted to a literal, physical absorption of his defeated opponent's vitality. This ritual was not an isolated eccentricity confined to first kills alone, but reflected a broader logic that ran throughout Scythian military culture. Warfare was understood, at a fundamental conceptual level, as a process of accumulation, in which a warrior's power and status grew in direct, measurable proportion to the number of enemies he had personally killed. Unlike the payment structures of settled civilizations, where soldiers typically received fixed wages or land grants for their service regardless of individual battlefield performance, Scythian warriors participated in campaigns with the explicit expectation that their compensation, their share of whatever plunder a successful raid or war produced, would be directly proportional to their demonstrated combat effectiveness. This created a practical administrative problem that Scythian society solved through a system that strikes modern observers as simultaneously grimly logical and deeply disturbing. Since battlefield claims of enemy kills could not simply be taken on faith, particularly in the chaos and confusion of actual combat, where multiple warriors might reasonably claim credit for the same fallen opponent, some form of physical verifiable proof became necessary before a warrior's claimed kills could be formally credited toward his share of communal spoils. That proof took the form of the enemy's severed head, presented directly to the ruling chieftain or king as evidence supporting the warrior's claim. Herodotus's account is explicit and specific on this point. A warrior who could not produce a head to substantiate his claimed kill received no share whatsoever of the plunder being distributed, regardless of how much fighting he had actually done or how significant his contribution to the overall military success might have been by any other measure. This created powerful, direct incentives for warriors to prioritize the physical collection and preservation of proof over almost any other battlefield consideration, transforming what might otherwise have been understood simply as combat into something that additionally functioned as a systematic, individually accountable harvesting operation conducted in the immediate aftermath of engagement while the battlefield remained under Scythian control. It is worth pausing here to note that this system, disturbing as its specific mechanics were to Greek observers and remain to modern sensibilities, reflects an internally coherent logic that many other warrior cultures across history have arrived at through different specific practices serving the same underlying function: the need for some kind of verifiable, non-falsifiable proof in a social system built around merit-based reward rather than fixed compensation. Later societies would develop different verification mechanisms: service records, witness testimony, decorations awarded through formal review processes. But the underlying problem Scythian society was solving, and the incentive structure it created, would recur across military cultures throughout subsequent human history in various forms, few of which involved anything approaching the specific grim solution the Scythians settled upon. What distinguished Scythian practice from many other warrior cultures that similarly rewarded individual battlefield achievement was the sheer thoroughness with which the human body, once claimed as proof of a kill, was subsequently treated not as a trophy to be displayed and then discarded, but as a genuine raw material, the starting point for an entire secondary economy of craft production that transformed the physical remains of defeated enemies into objects of continued daily use, display, and status signaling. This transformation, from battlefield casualty to durable manufactured object, represented a level of systematic, almost industrial processing that went considerably beyond the trophy-taking practices documented in many other ancient warrior societies. And it is this specific dimension of Scythian culture, the conversion of human remains into functional, everyday objects, that would prove, when later archaeology finally confirmed it, to be among the most historically startling confirmations of anything Herodotus ever recorded. There is a further dimension to this economic logic worth drawing out explicitly, because it explains why the practice persisted for centuries rather than fading as an occasional wartime excess. In a society with no coinage of its own, no centralized taxation system, and no formal military payroll, the distribution of plunder following a successful campaign represented one of the only mechanisms available for converting collective military success into individual household wealth. A warrior's family depended, in very concrete terms, on his ability to secure a share of whatever livestock, goods, and captives a raid produced, and that share was calculated according to a formula in which verified kills functioned as the unit of account, not unlike a piece-rate wage system, except that the currency being counted was proof of an enemy's death rather than hours worked or goods produced. Understood this way, the head count requirement Herodotus describes was not simply a grim cultural curiosity. It was the load-bearing administrative mechanism of an entire economy built around raiding, and it explains why failing to produce a head meant not just personal humiliation, but genuine, practical economic exclusion from the community's collective gains. Herodotus's description of Scythian scalping technique is detailed enough, and specific enough in its practical mechanics, that later scholars have generally concluded he must have been working from genuinely informed sources rather than second-hand rumor or invention, since the process he describes matches the anatomical and practical realities of the procedure with a precision that would have been difficult to simply fabricate from a position of complete ignorance. The process, as Herodotus records it, began immediately following the removal of an enemy's head, using a small, specifically suited knife to make an incision encircling the skull at approximately ear level, cutting through the skin in a continuous ring around the entire circumference of the head. Once this initial circular incision had been completed, the warrior would grip the scalp firmly, typically by gathering the hair into a secure hold, and then apply sustained, forceful pulling and shaking motions specifically intended to separate the scalp, skin, hair, and the thin layer of underlying tissue from the skull beneath it, a process that, when performed correctly, allowed the scalp to be removed as a single, largely intact piece rather than fragmented into unusable scraps. The removed scalp then underwent a secondary processing stage before it could serve any practical or decorative function. Herodotus describes warriors using the rib bone of an ox, selected specifically for its suitable shape and rigidity, to scrape away the remaining fat and tissue adhering to the underside of the freshly removed scalp, a step functionally equivalent to the fleshing process that any tanner working with animal hides would recognize as an essential preliminary stage in converting raw skin into a durable, workable material rather than a piece of tissue that would simply decompose. Following this scraping process, the scalp was worked and softened by hand, a manipulation process intended to break down the material's initial stiffness and render it pliable enough for subsequent practical use. What is particularly significant about Herodotus's account, and what later archaeological evidence would eventually confirm in striking detail, is his explicit statement that this entire process was not treated within Scythian culture as a shameful, secretive, or unusually gruesome act requiring concealment, but rather as a routine, almost mundane skill, one that Herodotus specifically compares to ordinary agricultural competence, noting that Scythian warriors regarded proficiency in scalping with the same practical, unremarkable pride that a farmer might take in a well-executed harvest. This comparison is worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures something important about how thoroughly this practice had been normalized and integrated into the ordinary fabric of Scythian military culture. stripped of the horror that observers from outside that culture inevitably attached to it. A warrior who performed the scalping process poorly, leaving the scalp fragmented, incompletely cleaned, or otherwise inadequately processed for its intended subsequent use, was reportedly viewed within Scythian society not primarily with moral condemnation, but with something closer to professional disdain, the kind of judgment a skilled craftsman might direct toward an incompetent peer who had failed to properly execute a technical process that any adequately trained practitioner should have been able to complete correctly. This framing, treating scalping as a skill subject to standards of craft competence rather than simply an act of violence, underscores just how deeply this specific practice had been woven into the practical, everyday texture of Scythian warrior identity. The purpose of this careful processing was never, according to Herodotus's account, simple disposal or the crude collection of a trophy to be set aside and forgotten. The processed scalps served ongoing, practical, and highly visible display functions within Scythian material culture, becoming integrated into a warrior's everyday equipment and dress in ways that ensured his combat record remained constantly, visibly present, rather than confined to memory or verbal reputation alone. This transformation of processed human remains into functional daily objects a warrior would handle, wear, and display in the ordinary course of his life, rather than store away as a separate category of ceremonial trophy, represents one of the most distinctive and, to outside observers both ancient and modern, most disturbing aspects of the entire Scythian warrior tradition, and it is precisely this dimension of the practice that the following episode will explore in greater detail. It is worth noting, too, how the specific technique Herodotus describes compares to broadly similar practices documented among entirely unrelated cultures, separated from the Scythians by thousands of miles and centuries of time, most notably certain indigenous peoples of North America, whose own scalping traditions, extensively documented by European colonial observers many centuries later, involved comparable anatomical technique, despite there being no plausible historical or cultural transmission connecting the two practices. Anthropologists studying this kind of convergent cultural development have generally concluded that scalping represents one of a relatively small number of trophy-taking methods that independent warrior cultures, working from broadly similar practical starting points, the desire for a portable, durable, individually identifiable piece of evidence proving a specific enemy's death, have arrived at repeatedly and independently across unconnected regions of the world, suggesting the practice reflects a kind of grim logical convergence rather than any single point of cultural origin radiating outward. Once a Scythian warrior had successfully processed a scalp into a softened, workable piece of material, its function within his daily life shifted from battlefield trophy to practical, visible equipment, an object that traveled with him, was regularly handled, and remained continuously present in ways that ensured his accumulated combat record could never simply fade from communal memory or be reduced to second-hand verbal claims that others might dispute or exaggerate. Herodotus records that processed scalps were commonly suspended from the bridle of a warrior's horse, tied on in a manner that kept them visibly attached to the animal's equipment during travel, raids, and everyday movement across the steppe. In this application, the scalp served a function analogous to a running visual tally, a walking record of accumulated kills that any observer, whether a fellow Scythian or a fearful enemy encountering the warrior for the first time, could immediately assess simply by counting the number of processed scalps hanging from a given horse's bridle. The system created an unmistakable, non-verbal hierarchy of battlefield reputation, one that required no boastful storytelling to establish, since the physical evidence was permanently on display for anyone to see and count for themselves. Beyond their bridal display function, processed scalps served a more immediately practical daily purpose as well. Herodotus describes them being used as a form of handkerchief or wiping cloth, employed by warriors to clean sweat, blood, or general grime from their hands in the ordinary course of daily activity, whether during active campaigning or simple everyday life on the steppe. This detail is worth emphasizing precisely because of how thoroughly it illustrates the normalization process at work within Scythian material culture. An object that outside observers would inevitably categorize as a horrifying trophy of violence had been integrated into the most mundane, unremarkable category of everyday practical tool, used casually and repeatedly without any apparent sense that doing so represented anything unusual or noteworthy within the warrior's own cultural framework. For the most successful and prolific warriors, those whose accumulated combat record over years or decades of campaigning had produced a substantial quantity of processed scalps, Herodotus describes an even more elaborate secondary use: individual scalps stitched together into larger composite garments, cloaks specifically constructed by joining numerous individual scalps into a single continuous piece of wearable material. These composite cloaks represented, within Scythian material culture, an exceptionally high-status garment, one that only a warrior with a genuinely extensive personal kill record could possibly assemble, since the garment's very existence depended entirely on having accumulated a sufficient quantity of raw material through the warrior's own individual battlefield accomplishments over an extended span of active campaigning. The psychological and strategic function of these garments, when worn into subsequent battles or displayed during diplomatic encounters with rival powers, deserves particular consideration. An enemy force confronting Scythian warriors arrayed for battle, some of whom were visibly wearing cloaks constructed from dozens of individual human scalps, would have been receiving an unmistakable, viscerally immediate demonstration of exactly what fate awaited defeated opponents. Not an abstract threat conveyed through words or reputation alone, but a direct, physical display of accumulated evidence, worn openly and without any apparent shame or concealment. This represents a particularly sophisticated, if deeply unsettling, form of psychological warfare, one that required no verbal communication to achieve its intended effect of demoralizing and intimidating opponents before actual combat had even begun. Modern military historians studying psychological warfare across different cultures and historical periods have consistently noted that the deliberate, visible display of processed enemy remains, whether through Scythian scalp cloaks, the head-taking practices documented among various other warrior cultures throughout history, or more recent historical parallels, served a consistent underlying strategic function regardless of the specific cultural context, transforming abstract military reputation into concrete, undeniable, immediately perceptible physical evidence that could shape an opponent's psychological state and battlefield decision-making before any actual fighting occurred. The Scythians, whatever the underlying belief systems that had originally motivated the specific practice of scalping and scalp processing, had developed one of the ancient world's most viscerally effective versions of this broader psychological warfare principle, one whose effectiveness Herodotus's own account, and the fear it clearly documents among Scythia's neighbours, suggests was thoroughly and deliberately understood by the Scythians themselves. There is also a social dimension to this display culture worth drawing out, since it functioned not only outward, toward potential enemies, but inward, within Scythian communities themselves. A young warrior arriving at a communal gathering with a bridal bear of any scalps, standing beside veterans whose horses carried dozens, would have experienced a form of social pressure, requiring no verbal humiliation whatsoever. The evidence spoke for itself, continuously and unavoidably, in a manner that shaped courtship prospects, standing within the warrior band, and a family's broader social position within the wider confederation. This is in effect a reputation economy made permanently visible, stripped of any possibility of quiet failure or private mediocrity. In a culture without written records to preserve genealogies of accomplishment across generations, the physical, countable trophy became the primary mechanism through which memory of individual worth was carried forward, worn daily, rather than recorded on a page that might never be read by anyone who mattered. Herodotus's account of Scythian trophy-taking extends well beyond the practice of scalping to encompass a further, even more specific and unsettling category of processing applied selectively to particularly notable or formidable enemies. The deliberate removal and preservation of the skin from an opponent's entire right hand and forearm, the hand, notably, that would have wielded the enemy's weapon in combat, making its selection for this particular treatment carry an implicit symbolic significance beyond mere practical craft material. The process, as Herodotus describes it, involved careful, complete removal of the skin from the hand and forearm following an enemy's death, preserving the material as intact as possible, including the skin of the individual fingers and, where possible, the fingernails themselves, apparently as a deliberate choice intended to maintain the recognizable overall shape and structure of the original hand, rather than reducing the material to an unrecognizable flat piece of processed skin. This preserved skin was then dried through exposure to air, a preservation method consistent with tanning and leatherworking practices documented across numerous ancient cultures working with animal hides, adapted here to human material through techniques that would have been broadly familiar to anyone in Scythian society, already skilled in the routine processing of animal skins for clothing, tent covering, and other practical applications. The finished product served a specific and practical function within Scythian military equipment: covers or coverings for the quivers that warriors used to carry and protect their arrows, one of the most essential and constantly used pieces of equipment in a warrior culture built so thoroughly around mounted archery. This application deserves particular attention for what it reveals about the complete integration of this practice into ordinary, everyday military equipment, rather than its confinement to purely ceremonial or decorative objects set apart from practical daily use. A quiver was not a trophy case set aside for occasional display. It was working equipment, handled constantly, relied upon in the heat of active combat, and essential to the warrior's basic battlefield function, meaning that a quiver cover, fashioned from an enemy's preserved hand skin, represented yet another instance of processed human remains being integrated into the most routine, functionally essential aspects of daily Scythian military life, rather than segregated into a separate category of purely symbolic or ceremonial trophy. Herodotus includes a specific and striking observation about the physical qualities of human skin that apparently informed Scythian preference for this material in practical applications. He records that human skin, once properly processed and dried, was noted for being notably thick and possessing a distinctively pale, attractive coloration, qualities that in his account are presented as making it, in some practical respects, actually superior in appearance and durability to many of the animal hide materials that might otherwise have served the same functional purpose. Whether this represents Herodotus's own direct observation, a claim relayed to him by informants he judged credible, or simply an unverifiable assertion he chose to include without independent means of confirming, the detail nonetheless illustrates the matter-of-fact, almost technical tone with which he approached, documenting even the most disturbing aspects of Scythian material culture, treating the practical properties of the material with the same descriptive precision a modern researcher might apply to comparing different types of leather. For nearly 2,500 years following Herodotus's original account, this particular claim, along with much of his broader description of Scythian trophy-taking practices, existed in a kind of historiographical limbo, neither confidently accepted as accurate nor definitively dismissed as invention, but generally treated by subsequent generations of historians and classicists with considerable understandable skepticism. Herodotus had, after all, earned a somewhat mixed reputation among ancient and modern scholars alike, sometimes affectionately and sometimes critically labelled the father of history for his pioneering methodological innovations, but also occasionally dismissed in certain circles as prone to including colourful, second-hand, and potentially unreliable stories collected from informants whose own reliability he had limited means of independently verifying. This scholarly uncertainty persisted until archaeological investigation and, eventually, modern forensic science finally provided the kind of independent, physical verification that literary and historical analysis alone could never conclusively establish. What emerged from careful excavation of Scythian burial sites across the Russian and Ukrainian steppe, combined with genuinely cutting-edge scientific analysis conducted in the 21st century, would transform Herodotus's most disturbing and long-doubted claims from unverifiable ancient rumor into a confirmed, scientifically documented historical reality, a vindication that arrived roughly 24 centuries after the original account had first been written down, and one that would fundamentally reshape how historians approach the broader reliability of his entire historical project. Beyond the treatment of skin, whether taken from the scalp or from an enemy's preserved hand, Herodotus documents a further and distinct category of trophy processing applied specifically to the skull itself, reserved, according to his account, for particular categories of defeated enemy, those judged by the Scythian warrior to have been especially formidable or worthy opponents in combat, or in a detail that reveals something significant about the internal social dynamics of Scythian communities, family members who had committed acts of betrayal serious enough to warrant this specific, severe form of posthumous treatment even against one's own kin. The processing of a skull for this purpose followed a specific technical procedure distinct from the treatment applied to scalps or preserved hand skin. Herodotus describes the skull being cut horizontally, typically at a level below the eyebrows, separating the upper portion of the cranium from the lower facial structure, producing a bowl-like shape from the upper skull that could subsequently be cleaned of any remaining internal tissue and prepared for its intended finished function. This cleaned cranial bowl was then reinforced and finished through the application of an external covering, commonly raw, untreated cattle hide, stretched and secured around the exterior of the bone, providing both structural reinforcement to prevent cracking and a more finished, presentable outer surface suitable for regular handling and use. For skulls belonging to particularly high-status individuals, either notably formidable enemies whose defeat carried special prestige, or wealthy individuals whose associated social status justified additional material investment in the finished object, Herodotus records an even more elaborate finishing process. The interior of the cranial bowl lined with gold, transforming what began as a battlefield trophy into an object of genuine material luxury, one that combined the symbolic weight of a defeated enemy's remains with the tangible economic value of precious metal, doubling the object's significance as both a war trophy and a display of the owner's material wealth and status. The finished skull cups served their most obvious practical function as drinking vessels, used specifically, according to Herodotus's account, for consuming the fermented mare's milk that constituted one of the Scythians' most important dietary staples, a beverage central enough to Scythian daily life and hospitality customs that the skull cups used to consume it occupied a correspondingly central place in the social rituals surrounding hospitality, guest reception, and the demonstration of a host's personal history and status to visitors. Herodotus specifically describes the social context in which these skull cups were most prominently displayed and used. When a Scythian household received a guest of sufficient importance to warrant particular hospitality and honor, the skull cup, or cups, for a warrior with an extensive combat record might possess several, each representing a different defeated opponent, would be brought out specifically for the occasion, filled with fermented mare's milk, and offered to the honored guest as part of the hospitality ritual. Crucially, this presentation was accompanied by verbal narration. The host would recount, in detail and evidently with considerable personal pride, the specific circumstances under which the skull's original owner had been defeated, the combat prowess that defeat demonstrated on the host's own part, and whatever other biographical details about the encounter seemed relevant to establishing the host's own reputation and standing in the eyes of his guest. This practice functioned, in effect, as an elaborate and highly personal form of social credentialing, a way of establishing a warrior's individual reputation and combat history through tangible, verifiable physical objects, rather than through verbal claims alone that a skeptical audience might otherwise have no independent means of confirming. In a society without written records, without formal military decorations, and without the kind of institutional documentation that settled civilizations increasingly relied upon to track and verify individual achievement, the skull cup served a genuinely functional social and administrative purpose, however disturbing its specific material basis might appear to observers operating within an entirely different cultural framework regarding the appropriate treatment of human remains. Archaeological excavation of Scythian burial sites across the steppe region has recovered numerous examples of gold-lined skull fragments consistent with Herodotus's description, providing physical, tangible confirmation of a practice that, like the scalping and hand-skin processing described in earlier episodes, had long existed in a state of unresolved historical uncertainty before archaeology finally provided independent verification. These recovered artifacts, now housed in museum collections across Russia, Ukraine, and various institutions studying Eurasian steppe archaeology, represent among the most direct and materially unambiguous confirmations available of just how thoroughly and specifically accurate Herodotus's original, centuries-doubted account actually was. The detail Herodotus preserves about family betrayal, warranting this treatment, deserves a closer look, because it reveals something important about how Scythian trophy culture extended beyond simple battlefield enmity into the regulation of internal social order. A kinsman who betrayed the community, whose specific offences Herodotus does not enumerate in detail, but which likely encompassed acts such as desertion, collaboration with an enemy power, or violation of some other fundamental obligation binding the extended kin group together, could apparently be subjected to exactly the same posthumous treatment reserved for the most formidable external enemies. Skull transformed into a drinking vessel used and displayed within the very household the betrayer had once belonged to. This detail complicates any reading of the practice as directed purely outward, against foreign enemies alone. It suggests instead that the skull cup functioned as a broader instrument of social memory and moral accounting, one capable of marking not just battlefield valor against outsiders, but the permanent, visible record of betrayal committed by someone who had once been kin, a warning displayed at the family hearth as much as a trophy displayed to visiting guests. For the better part of 2,500 years, Herodotus's most disturbing claims about Scythian trophy-taking practices occupied an uncertain position in the historical record, neither confidently accepted nor confidently dismissed, treated by successive generations of classical scholars with a kind of professional caution that acknowledged the specificity and internal consistency of his account, while withholding full confidence in its literal accuracy. Absent independent physical evidence that could conclusively confirm or refute what he had written. That situation changed decisively in the 21st century, when advances in ancient DNA analysis and other forensic archaeological techniques finally made it possible to definitively test material recovered from Scythian burial sites against Herodotus's specific claims, rather than relying solely on visual inspection comparative anatomy, or the kind of educated but ultimately inconclusive judgment that earlier generations of archaeologists had been limited to when examining ambiguous organic material recovered from ancient graves. In research published in 2023, a team of scientists conducted detailed genetic analysis on material recovered from Scythian archaeological sites, specifically identified, based on their context and construction, as quiver covers of the type Herodotus had described being fashioned from the preserved skin of an enemy's right hand. Using ancient DNA extraction and sequencing techniques far beyond anything available to earlier generations of archaeologists working with organic remains of this age and condition, the researchers were able to conclusively determine the biological origin of the degraded organic material still present on and within these artifacts. The results confirmed, with a level of scientific certainty that literary and historical analysis alone could never have achieved, that the material was indeed human in origin, genuine confirmation that at least some of the quiver covers preserved in the archaeological record had, exactly as Herodotus described roughly 2,500 years earlier, been fashioned from human skin rather than from animal hide, that later observers or Herodotus's original informants might have misidentified or exaggerated into something more dramatic than the underlying reality actually warranted. This finding carried significance, extending considerably beyond the specific artifacts directly tested. It provided, for the first time, genuinely independent scientific confirmation of one of Herodotus's most extensively doubted and frequently dismissed claims, offering strong corroborating evidence that his broader account of Scythian trophy-taking practices, the scalping, the skull cups, the composite garments fashioned from processed scalps, likely reflected genuine, accurately observed or reliably reported cultural practices rather than exaggeration, misunderstanding, or invention on the part of either Herodotus himself or the various informants and second-hand sources he had relied upon in compiling his account of a people whose territory he may never have personally visited in its entirety. The broader implications of this specific confirmation for how historians and classicists approach Herodotus's work as a whole deserve particular attention. His reputation across the intervening centuries had been genuinely mixed, oscillating between recognition as history's pioneering methodological innovator, the first writer in the Western tradition to systematically investigate, compare, and critically evaluate multiple sources of information about past events and distant peoples, rather than simply relaying myth and legend as unquestioned fact, and periodic dismissal, sometimes harsh, as an uncritical collector of travelers' tales and exaggerated second-hand accounts, a reputation that occasionally earned him the somewhat backhanded alternative nickname, Father of Lies, among more skeptical ancient and modern critics. The 2023 DNA confirmation, alongside decades of accumulating archaeological evidence from Scythian burial sites more broadly, the gold-lined skull fragments consistent with his description of ceremonial drinking cups, the material and construction patterns of recovered scalp-like organic remains, the broader physical evidence of Scythian material culture matching numerous other specific claims scattered throughout his account, has increasingly shifted scholarly consensus back toward taking Herodotus's most specific, detailed claims considerably more seriously than the more skeptical mid-20th century scholarly tradition had generally been willing to do. This does not mean every claim in Herodotus's sprawling, wide-ranging histories should now be accepted uncritically as literal historical fact. He did, after all, also record various claims about giant ants that guarded gold deposits and other clearly fantastical or garbled elements reflecting the genuine limits of 5th century BC geographic and ethnographic knowledge available to him. But on the specific question of Scythian trophy-taking practices, modern science has now provided physical, independently verifiable confirmation that Herodotus, whatever his occasional lapses elsewhere in his vast and ambitious work, was in this particular case describing something disturbingly, verifiably real. The broader methodological lesson this episode offers extends well past Scythian studies specifically, into how historians ought to approach ancient ethnographic writing more generally. For much of the 20th century, the dominant scholarly instinct when confronting a startling ancient claim unsupported by independent evidence was to assume exaggeration or error by default, treating skepticism as the intellectually responsible default position until proven otherwise. The Scythian scalping confirmation suggests a more measured approach, that ancient authors working carefully, drawing on informants with genuine access to the cultures they described, were capable of transmitting startlingly precise and accurate information even about practices that later readers, operating from within an entirely different cultural and moral framework, found almost impossible to credit at face value. Herodotus, in this specific instance, was neither a credulous collector of travelers' tales nor a moralizing propagandist exaggerating foreign savagery for rhetorical effect. He was, closer to what he always claimed to be, an investigator recording what his sources told him with as much precision as he could manage, and in this case, precision that took modern genetic science 2,500 years to catch up with and confirm. The reputation for battlefield ruthlessness that Scythian trophy-taking practices helped establish across the ancient world was not merely a matter of grim cultural curiosity for distant observers to marvel at from a safe distance. It carried genuine practical strategic weight, functioning as a form of psychological deterrence that shaped the calculations of even the most powerful empires the ancient world had yet produced. A reality demonstrated with particular clarity in 513 BC, when Darius the Great, ruler of the vast and formidable Persian Empire, led a massive military expedition northward, specifically intended to bring the Scythian territories under Persian control. The scale of the Persian force Darius committed to this campaign reflects just how seriously the empire's leadership regarded the Scythian threat and opportunity. Ancient sources describe an army numbering in the range of 700,000 soldiers, a figure modern historians generally treat with the same appropriate skepticism they apply to most ancient troop estimates, which were frequently inflated for rhetorical or propagandistic effect, but which nonetheless communicates the genuinely massive scale of military commitment Darius judged necessary for this particular campaign, reflecting the seriousness with which Persia's imperial leadership approached the prospect of subjugating the Scythian Confederation. What followed represents one of the ancient world's most instructive demonstrations of the strategic advantages nomadic mobility could offer against even the most numerically overwhelming conventional military force, and it stands as a direct historical antecedent to similar strategic patterns that would recur repeatedly across subsequent centuries of conflict between settled empires and steppe nomadic peoples, up to and including the Mongol campaigns nearly 2,000 years later. Rather than offering Darius the decisive pitched battle his massive army was organized and equipped to win, Scythian forces adopted a strategy of calculated, deliberate avoidance, continuously retreating before the advancing Persian army while systematically destroying anything of potential logistical value in their wake, burning grazing land, filling in or otherwise rendering unusable the water sources the Persian force depended upon for its survival across the vast, resource-scarce expanses of the steppe. This scorched earth withdrawal strategy exploited a fundamental strategic vulnerability inherent in Darius's massive conventional army. Its very size, which represented such an intimidating show of force on paper, simultaneously created an enormous and inflexible logistical burden, requiring correspondingly massive quantities of food, water, and fodder that had to be secured from the territory the army was actively passing through, since supply lines stretching back to Persian home territory could not realistically sustain a force of this scale across the vast distances involved. As Scythian forces methodically deprived the advancing Persians of exactly these essential resources, systematically retreating just ahead of Darius's main force while leaving nothing usable behind them, the Persian army began suffering escalating attrition from exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Casualties inflicted not through direct battlefield confrontation, but through the patient, deliberate exploitation of the invading force's own logistical vulnerabilities. Compounding this strategic pressure, Scythian light cavalry forces conducted continuous harassment raids against the periphery of the advancing Persian column, specifically targeting stragglers, foraging parties, and other vulnerable elements that inevitably separated from the main body of any large army moving across difficult terrain over an extended period. These harassment attacks, consistent with the broader Scythian military tradition documented throughout earlier episodes, did not spare captured or killed Persian soldiers from the same trophy-taking practices applied to any other defeated enemy, meaning that Persian soldiers advancing through Scythian territory would have periodically encountered the bodies of their own comrades, scalped and mutilated according to the practices previously described, a form of psychological warfare whose demoralizing effect on Persian troop morale can scarcely be overstated given everything the preceding episodes have established about how thoroughly this practice had been documented and feared across the ancient world. Herodotus preserves what purports to be a direct exchange between Darius and the Scythian king, conducted through messengers, in which the frustrated Persian ruler demanded that the Scythians either submit formally to Persian authority or, alternatively, cease their evasive tactics and meet the Persian army in a proper, decisive pitched battle befitting what Darius apparently regarded as appropriate martial conduct between legitimate opposing forces. The Scythian king's reported response captures, in a single pointed rhetorical exchange, the fundamental strategic and cultural gulf separating the two civilizations. He informed Darius that the Scythians possessed no cities and no cultivated fields whose defense might compel them to risk a decisive confrontation on Persian terms, and that if Darius genuinely wished to provoke direct battle, he should instead seek out and attempt to violate the ancestral burial grounds of the Scythian people, an act, the king pointedly implied, that would indeed provoke the kind of committed, no-holds-barred resistance that open territorial invasion of empty grassland had entirely failed to elicit, and one whose consequences for any Persian soldiers involved could be reasonably anticipated given everything the campaign had already demonstrated about Scythian treatment of defeated enemies. Darius, faced with an increasingly demoralized and logistically exhausted army that had achieved no meaningful strategic objective despite its overwhelming numerical advantage, was ultimately forced to withdraw from Scythian territory in what ancient sources uniformly present as a considerable and genuinely humiliating strategic failure, having suffered substantial troop losses to starvation, exhaustion, and continuous harassment without ever achieving the decisive pitched battle his massive conventional force had been organized to win. This episode would become one of the most frequently cited and analyzed examples throughout subsequent military history of how nomadic mobility and calculated strategic patience could neutralize even the most overwhelming numerical and logistical advantages that conventional, settled military powers could otherwise bring to bear. The strategic template established during this campaign, trade space for time, deny the invader every resource the surrounding land might otherwise provide, harass rather than confront, and let logistics rather than direct combat grind the larger force down, would recur across Eurasian military history with remarkable consistency for the following 2,000 years, employed with varying degrees of deliberate imitation or independent rediscovery by successive steppe confederations facing invasion from settled empires. To their south, Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, and the Wehrmacht's catastrophic advance into the Soviet Union in 1941 are sometimes cited by military historians, with appropriate caution about the differences separating Bronze Age cavalry warfare from industrial-era mechanized conflict, as later echoes of exactly the same underlying strategic principle Darius encountered on the Scythian steppe. An invading force whose scale and conventional strength become liabilities the moment an opponent refuses to fight on the invader's preferred terms, choosing instead to let geography, distance, and denied resources do the work that direct battlefield confrontation was never going to accomplish. Despite building no cities, raising no permanent monumental architecture in the manner of settled civilizations, and leaving behind no written records of their own to document their history in their own words, the Scythians nonetheless created one enduring category of monumental construction that has provided modern archaeology with an extraordinarily rich window into their material culture, social hierarchy, and religious beliefs. The kurgan, a large artificial burial mound constructed from accumulated earth and stone, raised specifically to house the remains of Scythian royalty, senior nobility, and other individuals of sufficiently elevated social status to warrant this substantial, labor-intensive form of commemorative construction. These kurgans, scattered across the steppe regions of Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan, in numbers substantial enough that they remain a defining feature of the regional archaeological landscape even today, represent a striking counterpoint to virtually everything else that characterized the nomadic, mobile Scythian way of life. Where Scythian households and settlements were designed for continuous movement and impermanence, kurgan construction demanded exactly the opposite: sustained, coordinated communal labor invested in creating a fixed, permanent monument intended to remain in a single location indefinitely, marking and commemorating the burial site of an individual whose status was judged significant enough to warrant this substantial departure from the community's otherwise thoroughly mobile existence. Excavation of these kurgans, particularly the larger examples associated with Scythian royalty and senior nobility, has revealed burial goods of extraordinary craftsmanship and material value, most notably elaborate gold jewelry and ornamental objects worked in a distinctive artistic tradition modern archaeologists categorize as Scythian animal style. Intricate, dynamic depictions of animals, frequently shown in combat with one another, or rendered with a stylized, energetic physicality that art historians consistently identify as among the most technically accomplished and aesthetically distinctive metalworking traditions to emerge anywhere in the ancient world. This gold, according to what can be reconstructed of Scythian belief systems from Herodotus's account and from the archaeological evidence itself, carried significance extending beyond simple material wealth, with its distinctive luster apparently understood within Scythian cosmology as symbolically connected to the sun and to concepts of enduring, incorruptible power appropriate for accompanying rulers and nobility into whatever afterlife their religious beliefs anticipated. The burial practices surrounding these kurgans, however, extended into territory considerably darker than the simple interment of valuable grave goods alongside a deceased ruler or noble. Herodotus documents and subsequent archaeological excavation has corroborated, through the discovery of multiple additional human remains interred alongside primary royal burials, a practice of ritual sacrifice specifically intended to provide a deceased ruler with appropriate attendants and companions for the afterlife journey his elevated status was believed to require. Upon the death of a king, several members of his household, reportedly including a concubine, a personal servant, and members of his practical household staff such as a cook, were killed and buried alongside him, a practice reflecting a belief system in which a ruler's need for appropriate personal service was understood to continue beyond death in a manner requiring literal, physical provision through human sacrifice rather than symbolic representation alone. Herodotus further records an additional subsequent phase of ritual sacrifice conducted approximately 1 year following the initial royal burial and interment. 50 young men, along with 50 of the finest available horses, were reportedly killed and then arranged in a specific and visually striking manner around the perimeter of the burial mound. The horses positioned upright, supported through preservation and construction techniques that allowed them to appear as though still standing, with the sacrificed young men mounted upon them in riding position, creating what amounted to a permanent, static honor guard of preserved bodies, arranged to appear eternally vigilant, standing watch over the deceased ruler's resting place, for as long as the elaborate construction could be maintained against the elements. This practice, whatever its precise underlying religious or cosmological logic within Scythian belief systems, produced what must have been among the most visually and psychologically striking funerary monuments anywhere in the ancient world. A mounted ghost cavalry, frozen in position around a royal grave mound rising from the otherwise empty grassland, a permanent physical demonstration of a ruler's continued authority and status, extending even beyond the boundary of death itself. Archaeological excavation of Scythian royal kurgans has recovered physical evidence broadly consistent with Herodotus's account of these practices, including the remains of sacrificed horses positioned in patterns suggesting exactly this kind of deliberate ceremonial arrangement around primary burial chambers, providing yet another instance in which patient archaeological investigation has confirmed details from his original account that earlier generations of skeptical scholars had been inclined to dismiss as exaggeration or invention. One of the most extensively studied examples of this royal burial tradition, the Pazyryk kurgans, excavated in the Altai Mountains region, straddling modern Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China, offered archaeologists an additional and unusually fortunate advantage. The specific permafrost conditions of that particular high-altitude environment preserved not just bone, metal and stone, but organic material, textiles, wood, and in several remarkable cases, tattooed human skin, in a state of preservation rarely available anywhere else in the ancient world. The tattoos recovered from these frozen remains, depicting the same dynamic, combat-oriented animal style visible in the goldwork found throughout Scythian burial sites, provided direct, startlingly vivid confirmation that the artistic tradition dominating Scythian metalwork was not confined to precious metal alone, but extended to the decoration of the living, tattooed body itself, physical evidence, preserved by pure geological accident across 2,500 years, of an entire dimension of Scythian visual culture that would otherwise have been almost entirely lost to history. Following the physical and emotional exhaustion of warfare, funeral rites, or other significant communal undertakings, Scythian society maintained a distinctive purification ritual that Herodotus documents with the same careful, descriptive attention he applied throughout his broader account, a form of bathing that notably involved no actual water contact with the body at all, reflecting practical adaptation to the cold, frequently water-scarce environment much of the Scythian steppe territory presented, particularly across the harsher regions extending towards Siberia. The ritual, as Herodotus describes it, involved constructing a small, tightly enclosed tent using layers of felt or animal hide arranged to create as sealed and airtight an interior space as available materials allowed. Stones were heated separately over an open fire until reaching a substantial, sustained temperature, then carried into the interior of this sealed tent and placed at its center. Once inside the enclosed space along with these heated stones, participants would throw handfuls of hemp seeds directly onto the hot stone surfaces, producing dense, immediate clouds of smoke that rapidly filled the confined tent interior. Creating an atmosphere participants would then deliberately inhale as part of the ritual's central purpose. Herodotus records that participants in this ritual responded to the resulting smoke inhalation with evident and vocal pleasure, crying out with apparent delight and exhibiting profuse sweating as a physical response to the combination of intense heat and the psychoactive effects of the hemp smoke they were deliberately, communally inhaling within the sealed tent's confined space. This specific account represents, according to the assessment of numerous modern historians and archaeologists specializing in the ancient use of psychoactive substances, among the earliest clearly documented instances anywhere in the historical record of cannabis being deliberately used for its recreational and psychologically relaxing effects, rather than for medicinal, religious, or purely practical purposes such as textile fiber production, which represents the more commonly documented ancient use of the hemp plant across various other contemporary civilizations. Within Scythian belief systems, as reconstructed from Herodotus's account, this ritual smoke inhalation carried purificatory significance, extending beyond simple physical relaxation or recreational pleasure. It was understood as a means of expelling not just the physical residue of sweat and grime accumulated through warfare, mourning, or other demanding communal activity, but the spiritual and psychological contamination believed to accompany such experiences, cleansing participants of whatever negative or dangerous spiritual residue violence, death, and grief were understood to leave attached to those who had directly encountered them. Archaeological excavations at Scythian sites have recovered charred hemp seeds and the remains of small enclosed structures consistent with Herodotus's description, along with metal implements interpreted by researchers as heating vessels suited to exactly this purpose, providing physical corroboration for this particular account that, like so much of Herodotus's broader description of Scythian culture, had once been treated with greater scholarly skepticism than the eventual archaeological record would ultimately support. The Scythian Confederation maintained its dominance over the Eurasian Steppe for roughly 5 centuries, before gradually being displaced and absorbed by successor nomadic confederations, most notably the Sarmatians, who emerged as the dominant power across much of the same territory in subsequent centuries, themselves eventually giving way to further waves of nomadic peoples moving across the same strategically vital grassland corridor over the following centuries and millennia. The Scythians left behind no cities for archaeologists to excavate in the conventional sense, no inscribed monuments recording their own history in their own words, and no direct linguistic descendants preserving their spoken language into the modern era in clearly identifiable form. What they did leave behind, scattered across the Kurgan burial mounds still visible today across the grasslands of Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan, is a material record extraordinary enough in its craftsmanship and historical significance that major museum collections around the world now proudly display recovered Scythian goldwork as among the most technically accomplished and aesthetically striking examples of ancient metalworking anywhere in their collections. Behind that golden splendor, as this series has documented across the preceding episodes, lies a considerably darker and more disturbing history of systematic violence, ritualized human trophy-taking, and funerary practices involving human sacrifice on a scale that modern visitors, admiring the recovered artwork in climate-controlled museum display cases, rarely have occasion to fully appreciate or confront. The Scythians' most enduring practical legacy, however, may ultimately rest not in their gold or in the specific, disturbing details of their trophy-taking practices, but in their fundamental military innovation, the mounted horse archer tradition, combining sustained mobility with ranged lethality in a combination that would echo across the following 2,000 years of Eurasian military history, providing a direct strategic and tactical antecedent to the nomadic cavalry traditions that later powers, most notably the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, roughly 17 centuries after the Scythian Confederation's initial rise to steppe dominance, would develop into even more sophisticated and historically consequential form. The core strategic lesson the Scythians first demonstrated so decisively against Darius's massive but immobile Persian army, that genuine military power on the open steppe was ultimately a function of speed, logistical self-sufficiency, and calculated ruthlessness rather than sheer numbers or fortified permanence, would be relearned, refined, and applied at even greater historical scale by the nomadic confederations that followed them across the same unbroken grassland corridor, long after the Scythians themselves had faded from direct historical memory into the golden, blood-soaked legend that Herodotus first recorded, and that modern archaeology and forensic science have now, disturbingly and definitively, confirmed to be substantially true.